Today's topic will be good versus bad hypotheses. How to write a good hypothesis for my outdoor investigation project. We'll be answering this question and many others throughout today's video. Before we can develop a hypothesis, we need to come up with a question. So, here's a question for you. What do birds eat? Is this a good question for an investigation? Think about that for a minute. So now that you've had some time to think, was that a good question? No, it was not a good question because it was too general. When questions are too general, they are too hard to design an investigation around. So if we're going to study about birds, we need to figure out what birds do we mean. Are we thinking the tropical birds, or are we thinking the birds that we're going to see? Probably it's going to be the birds that we see. Now, are we going to study all of the birds that we see? That would be a little bit unrealistic. Maybe we should just focus on the birds in our schoolyard, or the ones that we see on a regular basis, maybe on our back porch. So you have to narrow your focus. Since we've determined we're going to study the birds around school, we need a couple more questions to ask. For example, what do birds eat? If we can answer this question, then we're starting to narrow our focus for research and getting to the point where we can start to develop a good hypothesis. We know birds will eat birdseed. Some of them eat insects. Some of them eat sweet, etc. So we've determined that we want to study the birds around our school, and we've kind of determined what birds eat. So our new question could be maybe, what seeds do our feeder birds prefer? We're going to look at the bird feeder at school. Well, we can't really use the word prefer because we don't know what they prefer. We can only make observations. So a better question would be, what type of seeds do our feeder birds eat the most? Now we have finally come up with a good question. It is specific, and we can go and test it and figure it out. Now that we have our question, we have to make sure that it is doable. And doable is the key word here. Do we have enough time to complete this? We only have a few days in class, so we have to think about that, making sure that our questions can be accomplished within our class period. Can we afford the materials that we need? Ms. Corrins and I will provide a little bit, but really you need to provide all of your materials yourself for you and your group. Do we have enough background knowledge? Do we really know enough to be able to answer these questions? So when you're thinking about writing your research question, please make sure that it is doable and that you can answer all three of these statements. Okay, we've got our research question. Now we need to answer, what is a hypothesis? The most common answer we tend to find is that a prediction about what you think might happen in your experiment. We're going to go in with one possible answer to your question. A lot of times when you develop a hypothesis, there might be multiple answers to your question. Now that we know what a hypothesis is, you might be wondering, why do we need a hypothesis? Or several hypotheses for that matter. Well, a hypothesis helps you to clarify your question and helps you to design your experiment. When you have a good hypothesis, you can develop a good experiment. To build your hypotheses, you need to start with a question, and it's always good to make sure that your question has a comparison within it. For example, are male monarchs bigger than females? There's a comparison between two different types of monarchs. Or you could ask, are there more bugs found in Site 3 or Site 4 out on the schoolyard? Once you've figured out a question, turn that question into a statement. Male monarchs are bigger than female monarchs. Or you could say something like, there are more ants out on the sidewalk than in the woods. turn it into a statement. One of the most important characteristics about writing a hypothesis is to be specific. I cannot stress this enough. Do you want to study bugs? What type of bug? Be specific. Do you want to look at lots of bugs? Then you're going to call them arthropods. Or do you want to specifically look at ants or bees? The more specific you are, the easier it is for you to set up an experiment. I've got a question. I turned my question into a statement. And now I'm being specific. Well, what type of trap am I going to use to figure out? Am I going to use a potato trap? Am I going to use a pit trap? Am I going to use a sticky trap? Am I going to use a net? These are things that you have to be very specific about. And when you are writing your statements, take yourself out of it. Instead of saying, we will use a sticky trap, state that a sticky trap on the sidewalk will catch more ants than a sticky trap in the woods. It's extremely specific. Now we know where you are doing your research and what you are looking for. An example of a good hypothesis would be a pit trap in Site 3 will catch more ants than a pit trap in Site 8. I'm specific about what type of trap I'm using, where I'm using it, and what I'm looking for. We're going to call this our H1, our first hypothesis. Now we are also going to ask you to do a second hypothesis. What the second hypothesis does is it's basically reversing what you just did for your hypothesis 1. So for our hypothesis 2, a pit trap in Site 8 will catch more ants than a pit trap in Site 3. We just reversed everything that we did for our H1. We also ask you to do a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis basically means that the outcome, there's no scientific difference. So we're going to say a pit trap in Site 3 will catch the same amount of ants as a pit trap in Site 8. And it's entirely possible that this will happen for you. Are there any other possible answers to your hypotheses? If so, you may have more than 3 hypotheses. Now that you've learned all about hypotheses and writing a good question, have fun writing your hypotheses, and we look forward to seeing your research in action.